Well, thank you all for coming back. I know we spent a lot of time together this week. We had many conversations, and some of that will continue tonight. So hopefully, um, our conversations will be stimulating. I will be pushing a few buttons, perhaps raising the blood pressure of a few. And so we'll make this fun and talk about the kinds of things that are the matters of life and death today. Thank you to Professor Zubino for her kind introduction. Uh, we spent a lot of time talking together, and I met some of the other faculty as well and some of the students. So thanks for all of that. It has been a great week. Rosemary will be leaving tomorrow. I'll be leaving early Monday morning, and so this is right. Well, we have a party later, so it's not goodbye yet. You have my little data there. I may have to mention that at the end of that list is actually, I'm also affiliated with a management school at Vanderbilt Business School, which is always interesting because I don't think they like me very much, but they also cannot avoid having these conversations that we will have tonight. So let's go to the next slide. Tonight, I'll be talking about some of these terms. Actually, the last one is part of our focus, the Capitalocene. I don't know if you've heard this term. A lot of people these days talk about the Anthropocene, which is supposedly the age when human beings determine the future of the planet. So 8 billion, 9 billion human beings are supposedly the ones that are the problem. But maybe that's not quite the case. By the way, if you look at these various geological epochs, previous one was the Holocene. You may remember the Holocene from school. This is the last 11,000 years in the global geological history when it's the end of the Ice Age, the emergence of human civilizations, and so on. So Holocene, and of course there are many other scenes before. The planet is pretty old. But now people say we're in the Anthropocene. I'm saying perhaps we are in the Capitalocene. Why? Well, because these are the forces that shape our age. Now, I realize that talking about capitalism today is a little bit difficult. I do not hear a lot of theologians using the term, and oftentimes when they do, it's almost like they're using it as an insult. They complain about the various things that we've heard before, right? Greedy people, consumerism, and perhaps they're demonizing capitalists. And we have a few of those in the United States, which are certainly not great people. But those kinds of moral critiques don't quite get to the core of what we want to talk about. All week, we've been talking about relationships. So, this is really another conversation about relationships tonight. And the Capitalocene term is one that actually talks about relationships. Specifically, it is a way of talking about economic relationships that shape up as relations of power and specific concentrations of power. These economic relationships go very deep, and as we know, some benefit from them, and a lot of us don't. So, this is part of the question, right? What kinds of relationships are we talking about without necessarily moralizing about them? Because the question is not are they good or bad, but how could things be different? What else could we do? How else can we shape our relationships? Now, if you talk about economic relationships, something that theologians don't always do, it is important to see the connections connected to economic relationships or political relationships. And part of my argument has been that a lot of the problems in our politics today are really grounded in economic relationships. We always think it's politicians who are the bad guys. But these politicians, as one of my friends would say, we have the best politicians that money can buy, right? The best politicians that money can buy, because politics so often is shaped, driven, and influenced and funded by economics. Now, keep in mind that these relationships are not just relationships of power, they're also relationships of life and death. We know from history that these kinds of relationships have been deadly for many. And if we went around the room, I know each of you would have examples. They're not only deadly for people, but they're also deadly for the planet. So the reason that the planet is struggling, that the coral reefs are dying and those kinds of things, this is not acts of nature. This is also part of problematic relationships in the capitalist. By the way, this affects a lot more of us than we realize. Sometimes people in the United States think this affects the poor, and then they think of the poor as a minority. The truth is, the Capitalocene is not working for at least 99% of us. And you may be surprised to hear me say that even in the United States, the middle class is now in trouble. And even if you're doing well for yourself at the moment as a middle class American, you cannot guarantee that your kids will be okay, that your health care is taken care of, or anything else, your pension plans and so on. Something that is, of course, everyday reality for people around the globe, but that's also coming to the United States because of these capitalist relationships. Next slide. Because Jesus, the stories of Christ's life and ministry that we know are not royal images. They're actually images of struggle. A street person making a difference, embodying God, incarnating God. But here you have some images from 2,000 years of how God has been shaped in the images of dominant power. Today, I would submit to you, we're maybe not openly, certainly not in our liturgy, we're thinking about God more and more in terms of the dominant powers, which are in our world really the powers of the CEOs. CEOs, unlike politicians, are mostly not elected but picked. And CEOs have a sort of unilateral power that not even the ancient monarchs. Who is a CEO responsible to? This is just part of the job description. This is not bad CEOs or bad people, but the CEO is responsible to the welfare of the stockholders. An ancient monarch was at least responsible not just to the stake in stockholders, but also to the population, to the poor, to the sick, to people who were struggling. Uh, the modern image of God is becoming narrower and narrower, and this power is becoming more and more unilateral. And say that this God now resembles ancient images of a tyrant more than ancient images of an emperor. So these are important theological questions, and if we did a little excursion into the history, you would see that even classical images of God, Anselm of Canterbury comes to mind. His definition of God was that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Anselm of Canterbury did not think of God as a tyrant. This is why you have his whole theology of the cross, because God cannot really decide whether to do one thing or another. God is bound by the laws of the universe that God created. And so God has only a limited range of action, which is in some ways more biblical than it is now when we're thinking about God as able to do anything. But in the wake of this, you can see how theology has become a matter of depth. How this theology that saw God further and further up in the sky, further and further removed, actually has become deadly to many people on the planet. Next slide. That's just a brief overview of what the alternatives might look like. So we've seen the problem. We could talk a lot more about that. Perhaps we talk about it in the discussions. But let's look at what the alternative images are. These are some images of the Abrahamic God. And of course, Abrahamic traditions, as you know, include Judaism, Christianity, as well as Islam. Um, and interesting, the first two here, creation and Exodus, are stories that all three traditions have in common. But what images of God do we have in creation? In that second story of creation, if you open your Bible in the beginning and you start reading, all of a sudden you have a God who is creating Adam from clay and who is planting a garden. I mean, we've read this so many times that we might not find this curious, but think about it. In this creation story, God is actually getting the divine hands dirty. He's getting dirt into the fingernails. If you work in the garden, you know how your fingernails get. This is God doing the work of a potter, forming Adam from clay, doing the work of agricultural workers, planting a garden. And what's so interesting is this God could have very easily called some potters together, sent some agricultural workers into the fields, but doesn't. I mean, I know we talk about these as simplistic anthropological images, but maybe there's more going on. There's something about God here that contradicts the image of God as at the top, as the CEO, as the emperor. So that's one image here. The Exodus images are, in fact, even more interesting because what are they talking about? They're talking about God taking the sides of working people. In that case, the Hebrew slaves, and you have this in all three traditions Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. You get at one point, we'll get to that Exodus story in a little bit, but just for now, think about what the miracle of that Exodus story is. If you read in the Hebrew Bible, there's the story of a burning bush where God speaks to Moses. You remember it, right? And some people think, well, the real miracle is there's a bush burning in the desert that's burning but does not get consumed. Wow, isn't that exciting? But what if the miracle actually was God speaking to Moses and saying some things that are quite unexpected? What is God saying to Moses, right? Well, I have heard the cry of my people. I have seen their misery, and we're going to do something about it. As far as I'm concerned, that's the real miracle. God is very clearly taking the sides of the oppressed, of the slaves, and working for liberation. The only question as a theologian I would have is, what brought so long? Why now, right? Why not earlier? Maybe God learned something too. That's a big theological question. We cannot get into it too far tonight. But this is the question. God in solidarity with the people. And this is, of course, a very different way of understanding justice. In the Roman traditions, by comparison, justice means fairness. I think we talked about that the other day. You have the idea of the goddess of justice in Rome, goes back to an old Greek image as the one with the scales and the blindfold and the sword, being neutral. Now, in the US right now, we wish we had some neutrality in the justice system. I tell you, it's not a bad image. There's a bad image, and the better image comes to you from these ancient traditions. This is not God being neutral. This is God taking the side of the oppressed. Something we talked about, actually, one of the preachers talked about this here from the pulpit sometime this week. God actually taking the side of the oppressed. And this is the question of theology in the capital scene. Is God taking the sides of the dominant powers? Is God merely neutral? Or is God actually taking the sides of those who struggle? There's other issues I know we could talk about. What about the Canaanites? What about later? It gets a little complex, but if somebody wants to ask a question, there are some good answers. We can talk about this later. For now, keep in mind, we're talking about images of God on the side of people who struggle. And these are deeply rooted in our religious tradition. I just added Christmas here for comparison's sake, because that's a particularly Christian tradition. But it's a very similar story. You have God being born in precarious situation, as it were. Right? God is born in a stable. This, by the way, according to Karl Barth, is what transcendence means. Transcendence doesn't mean look up there far away, but transcendence means look to a different kind of immanence, look to a different place where God has been embodied. This is what Christmas is talking about. And again, when we talk then about big theological topics like the Incarnation or the Nicene Creed and the second and the first person of the Trinity, that's the stuff that ultimately matters. And as you remember from the Christian stories, God puts God's full force behind that, right? You have at one point the heavenly choirs of angels showing up. It's quite amazing, right? Imagine thousands of angels there showing up and performing for you. Um, but who are they performing for? I mean, think about it. For the ancient PR machine, the ancient social media, it would have been much easier if they had shown up somewhere on the Temple Square in Jerusalem or perhaps in Rome, in big plazas. But they didn't. They showed up in the fields with some people who were, doing menial labor, day laborers, who were herding other people's sheep. This is where the heavenly choirs of angel showed up. So think about this. These are real alternative images of God that we can reclaim. Next slide. So here now we have images of God in the capital scene number 2. On the left hand, you have this image of the Almighty in an office situation. And this is only tongue in cheek because this is how we live our life. If you work in an office, you know what I'm talking about. If you work in many other workplaces, you know that this is exactly what it looks like, right? You have somebody who is in control, and it doesn't really matter who you believe in. That person asserts their power and oftentimes shapes your images of God. But then on the other hand, this is an image of what in the US during the pandemic we called essential workers, right? Workers that are so essential that we could not survive without their labor. There's something we learned in there. What if these were images of God? Now, somebody might say, isn't it all the same? You're not thinking about God in human images, and you're making the same mistake whether you think about God at the top or God at the bottom. But what I'm arguing is it may not be the same mistake. First of all, there's a different image of power, there's a different image of control. Um, and secondly, this second image seems to match with a lot of images of God we have in the Bible. We just talked about the incarnation. This is one example. But think about the Hebrew Bible and many of the images there. You have God in all kinds of working functions, right? We already talked about the potter, the agricultural worker, but you have God in the image of a seamstress. By the way, feminized labor also shows up to describe God's word in the Hebrew Bible. Sewing, cooking, cleaning, metalwork, all of this stuff. You find so many images of God doing menial labor, which are usually ignored. And that to me is the striking thing. So why do we have these images, but why do they get it? What I'm trying to push here, and this is what we'll develop tonight, is that there's something in Christianity that has a real edge and that has to be developed further. So, question now is, how does all of that help us to make a difference? Next slide. We talked about some of this yesterday, and I don't know if all of you were there, but we have these ways of now playing God, as it were, in our societies. There's a problem for the powerful in each age, but especially in the capitalist scene, because there's always a lot fewer of them than there is of the rest of us. So they have to find a way to stay in power. And especially in democracies, this is difficult where you have people voting, right? How do you get people's votes? How do you get working people to vote against their own interests? Once you have answered that question, you know what's going on in the United States right now. But how does that happen? Well, the first one we know, that's divide and conquer. I talked about that yesterday a bit. Um, it's been going on for a long, right? You divide people against each other in order to conquer and, of course, to rule. This is how the ancient empires have worked, and this is how a lot of modern colonial, neo-colonial, and post-colonial structures still work. Maybe a little bit more hidden. It's easier to identify an emperor when he sits on the throne with a sword. But I think we're getting the point more and more. Modern constitutional democracies seem to be more inclusive and therefore perhaps are more difficult to divide. But even churches now, of course, seem to be inclusive, but divide and conquer is still going. The question is how to stay in power if you're the few over the many. And so the other thing I want to talk about here briefly, because that's the one I have not found anyone else talking about. I don't like repeating what everybody else says. I hope you've noticed this. When I say something, it's because I think it's really important and nobody else is talking about it. So uniting conflict is the thing, right? What is it? It is producing false identities in order to conquer people. I think I mentioned this yesterday briefly. White supremacy is one of the examples where in the let's look at the United States here specifically. In the United States, you unite white Americans in order, of course, to conquer everybody else, right? Black Americans, brown Americans, Hispanics, Latinos, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and all of it. That's the point of white supremacy, bringing white people together to conquer everybody else. What people don't realize is white supremacy also means bringing white people together in order to conquer most white people. White supremacy is actually not that beneficial for the white racists. They might feel better at the end of the day. They might have some privileges at the end of the day, but they still have no power. In the US, this goes back to the 17th century, actually. Virginia, there was a moment when white and black sharecroppers were working together in the fields. And when people work together in the fields, they develop some solidarity. What the masters realized is this is too dangerous. We cannot have this solidarity among white and black workers. And so racism came as a very useful tool here because the white masters were able to convince the white sharecroppers that via their racial identity, they had more in common with the white masters than with their black fellow sharecroppers. But of course, that was a lie. I mean, these white sharecroppers probably got some privileges. Maybe they got a little better housing, got a little better field. But in the end, their lives were much closer to the lives of the black sharecroppers than to the white masters. But white racism fooled them into believing you're at the same level. It's the way work relationships in the United States still work. White workers are led to believe they have more in common with white bosses than with the black workers. Sexism works in similar ways, right? Male workers are made to believe they have more in common with the male bosses than with their women colleagues, which is, of course, a lie. That's unite and conquer. You can play this out in various other ways. You can race here, ethnicity, nationalisms oftentimes function this way. German fascism functioned this way, fooling one of my grandfathers into believing, on the German side, right, believing that he had more in common with German Aryan identity than with the Russian workers that he was sent to fight as a German soldier. That, of course, was also a lie. Didn't benefit him much. He might have felt better, but that doesn't do much. So nationalism, religion can function this way as well, and this is how religion is used in the United States these days. Once you say God, once you say you believe in God, you're supposed to believe that you now have more in common with the politicians that talk about God, right? And of course, this is the Republicans, than you have with other people who might not talk about it. It's a false solidarity because this God is an empty signifier. This God is actually in the image of the dominant. may not be very good. They might say Christianity. Might make use of all the terms that you've heard in Sunday school. It's a false solidarity because there's no solidarity that they're interested in. They just want to get your vote, and the vote they get. So you see this unite and conquer here as a real problem. So solidarity that's based on sameness, on identities, that's based on these false signifiers is one of the big problems. And this is how the few stay in power over the many. This is how the God up controls everybody else. Now, what's the alternative? That's what I want to spend the rest of my talk here talking about. How do you think about solidarity differently? One thing that does not work is liberal solidarity, because liberal solidarity is mostly based on moralizing. Somebody telling you ought to be in solidarity with the poor, or telling the men you ought to be in solidarity with the women, or telling Americans you ought to be in solidarity with Pacific Islanders. Let me tell you, this is better than not being in solidarity at all. So don't want to put this down too far. Uh, it cannot be sustained. It cannot be built this way. Solidarity that's built on morality has two problems. Next slide, you'll see this in the quote from Lilla Watson. I don't know how well she's known here. She's an Aboriginal activist, a Maori activist from Australia, also an academic and an artist. This is a famous quote that is quoted in my part of the world a lot. So Watson is talking to a young, privileged, probably American, maybe privileged Australian activist that's saying, if you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. So that's the first step of solidarity, right? If you understand that your liberation is bound up with somebody else's liberation, you already have a much stronger foundation for your solidarity. It seems to make sense. I mean, I think that has to be said every time somebody wants to be in solidarity, unless you understand that your liberation is tied up together, you're wasting your time. Okay, so that's the one, but the next slide here is pushing it a little bit further. The next slide is from Basil. Next slide, please. Yes, this one. Basil Moore, who was actually a white theologian in South Africa. This comes from a book in the 1970s. And it says something similar than what Lilla Watson said, but stronger. Like most of us, I'm prepared to trust and stand alongside a man who's fighting for himself and his own freedom if I know that his freedom is bound up with. I cannot wholeheartedly trust the man who is fighting for me, for I fear that sooner or later he will tire of the struggle. So Watson says you're wasting your time. Moore says, I cannot trust you. But even well-meaning liberals that come and say, well, can we help you? You may not be able to trust them, not because they're bad people, and we've seen this time and again over time. We have seen this people walking away, people burning out. Burnout is a huge problem among activists. And it's understandable because it is not sustainable to simply push yourself without understanding that there is something deeper that connects us. So keep in mind, this is part of the problem we want to address here. Next slide. This is now this term of deep solidarity. I think it came up a few times very briefly, but that's where I want to spend my time now to talk about how we can build a solidarity that's not the false solidarity of unite and conquer, conservative solidarity mostly. It's not liberal solidarity that's simply based on moralizing, but it goes deep. Now, there's a biblical model going back to the Exodus, actually, just quickly. So don't think this is just Rieger's ideas. I think this is very deeply rooted in our faith and in our history also. So take this back to the Exodus struggle. uh, what's going on there, right? There's a solidarity that emerges not only between God and the people, that's really crucial. God's in solidarity, not just the Savior above. God realizes there's a common interest. But I'm going to talk quickly about Moses. What do we remember about Moses, right? He grows up in the palace, in the Pharaoh's place, and so he probably doesn't know what's going on, right? People living in the palace usually don't in the streets. And so one day he wanders out and he sees what's going on. He gets really, really angry, like a lot of activists. And what does he do, right? He kills the slave master, and that doesn't do anything. It does not end slavery. It does not change the mind of the pharaoh. That kind of speaking truth to power, well, it dissipates. Something else is needed. But what exactly is forming, right? You remember the story. Moses has to spend some time actually as a working person. He has to join the labor. He has to actually get a sense of reality. And based on that, then something else happens. Uh, but don't think of it only as Moses. I mean, the solidarity you see in the Exodus story now all of a sudden really explodes. You see Moses there, but who's around Moses? I mean, you know the stories, right? We know there's his brother Aaron. In Islam, it's Harun. Um, there's his sister Miriam. Uh, but don't forget that Miriam was involved in the very beginning too, right? When Pharaoh wanted to kill all the kids. There is the sister, and then there are two Hebrew midwives, Shipra and Pua. Look it up. This is in the book of Exodus. These are people in solidarity. They're in the struggle. So there is a real solidarity story here that we're not usually telling. We're telling it perhaps as the heroic story of Moses, but there's a community working together that includes not only men but also women. In Islam, there is one more woman that you may not ever have heard about if you haven't studied Islam much, but there's Asiya. Anybody ever hear about Asiya? She was the wife of Pharaoh, and in this ancient struggle, she actually takes the side of the Hebrew slaves. So you have in the palace itself solidarity emerging, where the 1% also have the opportunity to put themselves in solidarity with the 99%. And so Asiya in Islam becomes that person. This is different from the Exodus stories. Um, and next, she's one of the two holiest women in Islam, Asiya. You know who the other one is? Mary, Maryam. There's more about Mary in the Quran than there is in the Bible. So there's some overlaps here. I mean, there's some interreligious learning here also that could be very helpful. So here's solidarity. Now, what's the basis of solidarity? A lot of people think maybe it's identity, it's nationality, it's ethnicity, maybe race or something like that. Maybe it's religion. Um, what I'm arguing here is that there's that, but something else that we're not usually thinking about. I think St. Paul got that in 1 Corinthians 12. This is that beautiful image of Christ's body, the body of Christ, the church, which is an old Roman Empire image that Paul turns on its head. In the old empire image, the empire is at the top and everything is beautifully organically related. Nothing ever changes. In Paul's image, it ends with talking about that if one member suffers, all suffer together with it. That's the basis of solidarity. One member suffers, all suffer together with it. If one member rejoices, all rejoice together. That's the other part of it. In this image of 1 Corinthians 12, there's even images of class struggle. That may come as a shock. Well, we shouldn't talk about class struggle in polite company, but let's do it. What does Paul say, right? The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, this is from 1 Corinthians 12 now, verses 21 and 22. On the contrary, the members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. It's the story of the essential workers. the members of the story that we don't, of the body that we don't take into account are indispensable. This is a total reversal of the imperial top-down story, the theological reversal, and I think it's also a reversal of community and eventually of the church. I could give you other theological images, but keep in mind this is really deeply rooted in our faith traditions. Maybe one more. This is the famous commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. This one, of course, is another one that's very interesting because usually it is moralized to say you should love your neighbor as yourself. And of course, it never really happens, right? I mean, you try that for a bit, maybe on Monday after Sunday, but it doesn't really last. It's not sustainable. You burn out. And so the liberals come along and they say, well, you have to love yourself first. Okay, that's fun too. But nothing changes either, right? By loving yourself first, maybe you feel better, but you haven't really changed necessarily the structures of society. So another way, by some Jewish philosophers, there's Martin Buber, Emmanuel Levinas, would be to say, what if the neighbor were actually part of who we are? This is part of deep solidarity. What if the neighbor is part of who we are, except we don't usually recognize it? That's the problem. We don't see what the neighbors are, how close they are to us. But once that's clear, you have the basis of a solidarity that is now much stronger than anything you can do via moralizing or pampering yourself. You now see there is something we have in common without giving up your diversity. This is not a matter of now saying, yeah, this is actually the solidarity circle slide again. No, sorry, this is the deep solidarity slide talking about the solidarity circles. This is a program that we've developed at the When the Cook program. You can look it up there at our website, where we're putting this thing in practice. We've tried to do this with about 250 churches now, where we're putting faith communities and examples of the solidarity economy together in the hope that we're building this deeper solidarity across all levels. So religion, politics, economics, all together, understanding that these things work in both directions. So this is something, and Manu Falau and I can talk about this tomorrow morning. There might be some ways of bringing some of your communities into this project as well, because we found this really helpful. That this is not just now me talking about some big theological concepts, but us actually doing this work on the ground with actual faith communities. We meet for 9 months, usually via Zoom once a month. And we do the theological work, we do the organizing work, and the case studies go with it as well. But at the end of my presentation, I want to talk a little bit about what is holding us back here. What is the problem? Why is it that we're not more naturally embracing deep solidarity? Again, it goes back to divide and conquer and unite and conquer. And here is a conceptual mistake. This is really crucial to understand, and this is where I want to conclude. Give me about 5 or maybe a little bit more minutes for that conclusion. The conceptual mistake in a lot of theology is, well, first of all, we're not good at analyzing power. Even though we say we want to analyze power, you cannot analyze power without these bigger structures, number one. Number two, we're confusing privilege and power. I think this is one of the big traps here that we still have to figure out. Privilege, of course, is a real thing. As I said earlier, with these white sharecroppers, they had white racial privilege over the black sharecroppers, a privilege that was given to them for the most part, by the white masters, who loved racism because it upheld the master's position. So privilege is real. White privilege is real. European American privilege is real. So I stand here before you as a white European American privileged academic, married, 2 children, straight, happy family, elite university, elite professorship. So I have a lot of privilege. However, and I'm not complaining about my life, don't hear me wrong. I need to understand that this privilege does not give me the kind of power to transform the world. Now, my world wants me to believe that, as the great Professor Rieger, all I need to do is stand at the lectern and speak truth to power, and the powers fall around me. That does not happen. In fact, they love it when I think that way because then I'm fooled. I'm the one who then sort of keeps pushing against oppression and colonialism and all the bad things and capitalism, um, and nothing changes. Up until recently, nobody got too worked up about it. Now Trump gets a little more nervous. Maybe he knows there's a problem. But what we're seeing here is even my privilege, which is tremendous, does not really translate into power. This is the problem with white supremacy. It suggests to white privileged people that have real white privilege that they have power, which they don't. And so, what happens when you confuse privilege and power is you're directing, first of all, you're directing the blame to the wrong people. In the US, usually the middle class, the white middle class, gets blamed for everything. Who's off the hook is the white ruling class. In the church, church people get blamed for a lot of things. Who is off the hook? The leadership. You see how this goes, right? Now you're blaming white supremacists. Who is off the hook? The people that play white supremacy for themselves. This gets really interesting. I just sent an article to Professor Zubino, who can share it with you, when you talk about the missionaries. Because if you think about the missionaries, they usually get blamed for everything, right? The missionaries came here, they took control, they were the bad guys. But even the missionaries had a lot of privilege, but not that much power. This was part of George Tinker's work. I think I mentioned it the other day, who said these privileged white missionaries in the U.S. to the Native Americans, they actually brought colonialism with them. They didn't benefit from it. So somebody else benefited, somebody else made all the money. Now we look back and we blame the missionaries. My point is not to excuse the missionaries. My point is not to say that people like myself, missionaries and people with privilege, do not need repentance and conversion. We need to know what we need to repent of and be converted from. That's the big question. Because if you go in this false direction, you're creating two problems. First of all, you have privileged people overestimating what they can do. And by the way, if you ask me, I'll make a really unguarded comment here that will get me in trouble. If you ask me, this is one of the problems with the WCC. They think they're so privileged, they just have to go and knock at the doors of the United Nations and they change the world. And they don't. I'm sorry. I mean, not that they haven't done a lot of good, don't get me wrong, but this is not how you end the capital of sin. Now I've said it, maybe this will really get me in trouble. But think about it. Um, what is the alternative? Remind yourself of your privilege, use your privilege, but use it differently. Use it not thinking that you have the power, but use it realizing that you have to build power together with everybody else. This is how you move. This is how you organize. Now, it's not a couple of people in suits knocking on somebody else's door in a suit. Now it is the mass of the people working together, actually moving forward together. And that gives you a sort of power that's really surprising that can change the world. Without this, all you ever do is run against closed doors, or perhaps you have a nice lunch with someone and nothing changes. In the US, they do all kinds of things. You get to fly in somebody's private jet, you get to spend a vacation in somebody's mountain house and so on, thinking you're now powerful, but you're not. So this is how a lot of middle class and even privileged middle class people get fooled. And of course, it doesn't work for the other communities either. So if your hope is in people with privilege doing something for you, you will be very sorely disappointed because it cannot happen. It's not happening. So this is the double problem. People with privilege overestimating themselves and people that have less privilege putting their hope in people with privilege without thinking about how we build power. So back to the missionaries. If the missionaries had realized who's really winning the colonial struggle, who's really benefiting from this, maybe this would have been part of their own conversion experience because there's always a two-way street. Missionaries are not just people who convert others, they're also people who are converted in the process of what they do. So this would have been the opportunity for the old missionaries to say, hey, maybe we have more in common with the people than we ever realized. Maybe this is where our true solidarity lies. Maybe this is who our true neighbors are. This is how the body has to come together. And imagine what powerful conversions this could have brought on all sides, on the side of the missionaries included. Today, this is the conversion that I'm preaching to a lot of my colleagues in the United States. Maybe this is the conversion that we need. And it's, personally speaking, the conversion that I need personally every day. So once you start looking at these things, now the question is, what do you do? Maybe don't divest yourself of whatever privilege you have. Now, this is a community that also has privilege. Do not divest yourself of it, but use it, apply it, see what you can do. And I guarantee you, in this process, your privilege will be transformed for the good. I could tell you some personal stories. Some of it is hard learning. You know, you put your white male privilege in the struggle, and you'll realize very soon that you cannot go home again because they now know you're a traitor, right? They now know that maybe you're not safe. And so, even though you may have a white male theological identity, your old white male professors and friends in the theological world will not trust you anymore for good reasons. But people might trust you, and this is, of course, what we're getting. So we can talk more about this, but this is at the core here how we rebuild solidarity and how I believe theology can now finally become a matter of struggle for life rather than constantly dealing with death. Final words here about divine solidarity. What I've said about people's solidarities, I think you can apply also to thinking about God in solidarity. We've already said God is taking sides, and maybe not just out of the divine goodness of the divine heart, but out of this understanding that creation has a core where we belong together in the struggle. Let me end with an interesting paradox. Taking sides, and this is the interesting philosophical thing here. Taking sides makes the divine love more universal. That sounds strange, right? Taking sides makes the divine love more universal. We think, when we talk about context, it becomes more contextual and therefore it relates to you and to me and all of this. But in the end, it seems to me that is the way forward to reclaim the universal. My example here is Mary, the mother of Jesus. We already talked about her briefly. We thought about the Quran and Islam. But take it back to Christianity. In the Gospel of Luke, you have Mary's song of praise, the Magnificat. And what is she saying? She's talking about God who lifts the lowly from their thrones. That story you know, right? Who fills the hungry with good things. And by the way, this preaches easily. You take this into your churches. Unless they're really hardcore Trumpists, they will get it. Well, yes, God lifts up the lowly, God fills the hungry with good things. That's wonderful. But there's always a second part to this. God lifts up the lowly servant and pushes the powerful from their thrones. God fills the hungry with good things and sends the rich away empty. That's the second part, right? It's sort of like in the Gospel of Luke, blessed are the poor and woe to the rich. It's very hard to dispute via Matthew, blessed are the poor in spirit. Take your Bible seriously. It's what it says. This is the word of God, people of God. I didn't make this up. It's just there, and we have to deal with it. But why is this universal? Well, here is what I'm thinking. those who are sitting on the thrones will ultimately be saved by being pushed from their thrones. But this is not punishment. This is not condemning people forever, but this is calling them to accountability. Sending the rich empty once in a while might be the best thing that happened to them in their whole lives. Experiencing something else, a bigger solidarity. Uh, and of course, divine judgment is at the end what is the hope of the world moving beyond the capital C. There's other paradox that people think. I mean, for a lot of people, this is what one of my teachers 30 years ago used to say. He says it's easier for people to believe in the end of the world, to think about the end of the world, than to think about the end of capitalism. Test yourself. Easier to think about the end of the world than to think about the end of capitalism. But maybe that's what has to end in order for God to be God. So thank you so much. I hope we'll have some spirited discussions now.